It started with a legal envelope no one inside Buckingham Palace was supposed to see. But when Queen Camilla emerged from that private meeting with royal lawyers, looking pale and furious, even veteran aides knew something catastrophic had happened. Within hours, whispers spread through palace corridors that a secret directive tied to Queen Elizabeth II had finally been activated. And according to insiders, it threatened to strip Camilla of the very status she fought decades to secure. The meeting itself was never supposed to attract attention. According to reports circulating among palace administrative staff, the gathering had been quietly scheduled inside Clarence House under extraordinary secrecy, with several senior constitutional advisors allegedly arriving through a private entrance normally reserved for emergency crown matters. At first, many assumed the discussions were connected to King Charles III's continuing health concerns, especially after months of visible strain surrounding the monarch's public appearances since early 2024. But insiders now whisper that the atmosphere inside that room was far colder than a routine constitutional briefing. Something unexpected had reportedly surfaced inside a protected legal archive tied directly to Queen Elizabeth II's final years. And the moment Camilla allegedly realized what those papers contained, the tone of the entire meeting changed. Palace aides were reportedly instructed not to discuss the unusual movement of legal advisors across royal residences, an order many longtime staff members found deeply unsettling. Various interpretations of the situation describe officials speaking in lowered voices, security teams tightening access around sensitive offices, and senior courtiers suddenly canceling scheduled engagements with almost no explanation. Those familiar with royal protocol insist this level of silence usually signals one thing only: internal constitutional conflict. And according to several royal commentators, references began emerging to what insiders allegedly called conditional consort protections, a phrase that immediately sent shock waves through the old guard of the monarchy. Even among experienced royal observers, the wording felt chillingly deliberate. It suggested that Camilla's position as Queen Consort may never have been as untouchable as the public had been led to believe. What truly intensified the panic, however, was the growing belief that Queen Elizabeth II herself may have quietly anticipated a future crisis involving the balance of power inside the monarchy. Reports suggest the late Queen had spent years safeguarding what she privately viewed as the sacred stability of the crown during a period of growing uncertainty surrounding succession, public trust, and royal legitimacy. Different interpretations of confidential palace discussions now describe hidden constitutional guidance allegedly prepared during her final years, guidance designed not for public release but for institutional survival in the event of internal disruption. And according to whispers spreading through Buckingham Palace, those protections may have finally been triggered. The emotional strain surrounding the situation reportedly became impossible to hide. King Charles III was allegedly seen exhausted and withdrawn after the meeting, fueling speculation that the monarch had been caught between personal loyalty to Camilla and the growing pressure of royal duty. Meanwhile, tensions between Camilla and Princess Anne were said to escalate almost immediately behind closed doors. And, often described by palace insiders as the iron-willed guardian of royal continuity, has long been associated with protecting the institutional framework built by Queen Elizabeth II. Now, according to various interpretations of recent palace behavior, she appeared increasingly determined to prevent any threat to what insiders often call the sacred machinery of the crown. For years, the public believed Camilla's rise to Queen Consort had finally closed one of the monarchy's darkest chapters. But behind palace walls, insiders now whisper that Queen Elizabeth II never viewed the arrangement as permanent. Instead, reports suggest the late monarch attached quiet conditions to Camilla's acceptance, conditions few people inside the institution were ever meant to discuss publicly. The announcement itself had once appeared historic, almost carefully designed to signal peace after decades of scandal, resentment, and public division surrounding Charles and Camilla's relationship. When Queen Elizabeth II publicly expressed her sincere wish that Camilla would one day be known as Queen Consort, many believed it marked the end of a painful royal conflict that had haunted the monarchy since the days of Princess Diana. But according to insiders who claimed to have knowledge of confidential constitutional conversations during those final years, the reality inside royal circles may have been far more cautious than the public ever realized. Various interpretations of those private discussions now suggest Queen Elizabeth II's support was never intended as unconditional surrender to Camilla's growing influence. Instead, palace administrative streams allegedly treated the arrangement as a carefully managed compromise designed to protect the monarchy during a fragile period of succession. The old guard surrounding the late queen reportedly feared that public resistance toward Camilla had not truly disappeared, but had merely gone quiet in the face of Elizabeth's immense personal popularity and the institution's desperate need for stability. Even after the official announcement, whispers allegedly continued inside Buckingham Palace that certain constitutional boundaries regarding Camilla's ceremonial authority remained deliberately undefined. And according to royal historians now revisiting older precedents involving royal consorts, the ambiguity may not have been accidental at all. Those familiar with palace traditions often point toward centuries-old tensions surrounding consort influence inside the British monarchy. While consorts may stand beside the sovereign, they do not inherently command the institution itself. That distinction, insiders claim, became increasingly important as Camilla's role reportedly expanded beyond what some senior royals initially expected. Princess Anne and Prince Edward were allegedly drawn into confidential oversight discussions during Queen Elizabeth's final years, discussions centered not on public scandal but on preserving the long-term legitimacy of the crown itself. Reports suggest those deeply protective of institutional continuity became increasingly uneasy over what certain palace figures privately described as the emergence of parallel royal authority around Camilla's inner circle. It was not necessarily about formal power. It was about influence, access, control, the invisible mechanisms that quietly shaped the monarchy from behind closed doors. As King Charles III's health struggles intensified following his cancer diagnosis, those concerns reportedly grew sharper. Sources close to palace administrative operations claim some aides began noticing shifts in communication channels, alterations in advisory structures, and an increasing concentration of unofficial influence surrounding Camilla's trusted allies. Royal commentators now whisper that this was precisely the scenario Queen Elizabeth II had feared during her final years, a weakened monarch surrounded by competing factions inside an institution already under enormous pressure. Different interpretations of archived palace memoranda allegedly describe carefully constructed safeguards intended to prevent any single consort figure from accumulating unchecked institutional leverage during periods of royal vulnerability. And according to several long-time royal observers, the late Queen may have quietly ensured those protections could be activated without triggering a public constitutional crisis. What makes the entire situation even more explosive is the growing belief that Camilla herself may never have fully understood the invisible limitations surrounding her position. Palace insiders claim certain ceremonial privileges were always conditional, quietly dependent upon maintaining institutional balance and public trust. But as tensions reportedly deepened between Camilla's camp and senior members of the royal establishment, especially Princess Anne, the atmosphere inside palace walls allegedly shifted from cautious management to outright alarm. Suddenly, conversations once dismissed as paranoid whispers began resurfacing with frightening clarity. Questions about hidden constitutional guidance no longer sounded impossible. They sounded prepared, planned, and according to those closest to the palace archives, the moment Camilla allegedly crossed an invisible line, dormant royal protections suddenly roared back to life. The crisis reportedly exploded after private concerns emerged over who was truly controlling access to the king during his illness. What began as whispers about scheduling conflict soon evolved into accusations of influence, exclusion, and strategic manipulation at the very heart of the monarchy. And insiders claimed that was the moment powerful royal figures decided enough was enough. Palace staff had allegedly tried to dismiss the growing unease as nothing more than routine adjustments surrounding King Charles III's medical treatment. Publicly, the monarchy continued projecting stability, carefully managing appearances while emphasizing the king's determination to continue serving despite his ongoing health battle. But behind closed palace doors, according to administrative whispers now leaking into elite royal circles, tensions had reportedly reached dangerous levels. Senior aides allegedly began noticing that access to the monarch was becoming increasingly difficult to predict. Meetings were quietly rescheduled. Certain advisors reportedly found themselves waiting days for responses that once came within hours. Others allegedly discovered discussions they believed had been approved were suddenly postponed or redirected through entirely different channels. At first, many blamed confusion surrounding Charles's treatment schedule. But over time, insiders claim a far darker suspicion began taking hold inside the institution. Reports suggest Camilla's inner circle gradually gained unusual influence during this fragile period, particularly concerning which conversations reached the king directly and which were filtered through layers of palace administration. Various interpretations of internal communications now describe an atmosphere of mounting frustration among senior royal officials who feared the traditional balance of constitutional access was beginning to fracture. What made the situation even more explosive was the belief that this influence extended beyond domestic scheduling matters and into discussions involving long-term institutional decisions. Palace commentators have speculated that some members of the old guard became deeply alarmed by what they privately described as parallel advisory structures forming around Camilla's trusted allies. It was not simply about personal loyalty anymore. It was about who controlled the flow of information around a vulnerable monarch during one of the most uncertain periods of his reign. As whispers intensified, Prince William and Princess Anne reportedly began pushing for tighter institutional oversight behind the scenes. And, long regarded by palace insiders as the monarchy's fiercest defender of protocol, allegedly viewed the situation as a growing constitutional threat rather than a family disagreement. William, meanwhile, was said to be increasingly concerned about public trust in the monarchy if rumors of internal power struggles continued spreading beyond palace walls. Different in Terp. Retations of private meetings held inside Buckingham Palace suggest phrases like constitutional risk and institutional exposure began appearing with alarming frequency during discussions among senior advisors. Royal historians and commentators have since pointed toward older constitutional precedents involving royal consorts whose influence became politically sensitive during periods of national uncertainty. According to those familiar with the monarchy's internal traditions, quiet safeguards have historically existed to prevent unelected figures surrounding the sovereign from gaining disproportionate operational authority. And as fears surrounding Camilla's expanding influence reportedly deepened, claims began surfacing that dormant legal frameworks tied to consort limitations were quietly reviewed once again. Sources close to palace administrative operations suggest archived memoranda, constitutional guidance papers, and ceremonial authority documents connected to Queen Elizabeth II's final years were suddenly pulled back into active discussion. The divide inside the monarchy allegedly became impossible to ignore. On one side stood those determined to preserve what they viewed as institutional continuity at all costs. On the other stood Camilla's increasingly isolated loyal faction, accused by critics of consolidating influence around the king during a moment of extraordinary royal vulnerability. Even longtime palace staff reportedly sensed the atmosphere changing. Conversations became colder. Trust reportedly eroded between once cooperative royal households. And while the public continued seeing carefully orchestrated smiles during official appearances, insiders whisper that behind those palace walls, the monarchy was entering one of its most dangerous internal battles in decades. Buried inside layers of royal protocol, constitutional memoranda, and sealed advisory notes was something insiders now describe as Queen Elizabeth II's final insurance policy. Not against foreign threats, not against political unrest, but against internal instability inside the House of Windsor itself. And according to reports, Camilla's name was directly connected to those precautions. For decades, Queen Elizabeth II was regarded inside palace walls as more than a monarch. She was viewed as the living anchor of institutional survival, a ruler shaped by crisis after crisis who understood better than anyone how quickly personal relationships could destabilize the crown itself. According to various interpretations of confidential palace history, the late queen spent her final years preparing not only for succession but for the dangerous uncertainties she believed might emerge after her passing. Reports suggest those preparations went far beyond ceremonial planning or public transition strategies. Hidden beneath layers of constitutional procedure, insiders now claim, were quiet legal advisories designed to preserve the monarchy's internal balance if power structures around the sovereign ever became compromised. Royal experts revisiting these alleged documents have increasingly referenced the phrase conditional ceremonial authority, a concept that has suddenly become one of the most explosive subjects circulating among elite royal commentators. Those familiar with constitutional traditions claim the distinction is subtle but powerful. A consort may carry status, visibility, and ceremonial recognition, but that authority does not necessarily translate into permanent institutional control. According to insiders, Queen Elizabeth allegedly feared the public misunderstood that difference entirely. The late monarch reportedly viewed the crown not as a personal inheritance to distribute emotionally, but as a sacred structure requiring invisible safeguards against instability from within. And while the public celebrated Camilla's rise beside Charles as a final chapter of reconciliation, palace administrative streams allegedly continued treating her authority as symbolic, conditional, and tightly confined within boundaries established long before Charles became king. That belief reportedly shaped the secret advisories prepared during Elizabeth's final years. Different interpretations of private palace discussions suggest senior aides were quietly instructed to preserve specific constitutional barriers regardless of future personal dynamics surrounding the monarch. Princess Anne, long viewed by insiders as the monarchy's fiercest institutional loyalist, was allegedly involved in maintaining continuity around those protections after Elizabeth's death. Sources close to palace administrative circles claim and viewed the safeguards not as attacks against Camilla personally, but as necessary protections against any future imbalance inside the House of Windsor. To Anne and members of the Old Guard, the monarchy's survival depended on preserving the invisible distinction between proximity to the sovereign and control over the institution itself. As rumors surrounding these secret protections began leaking beyond elite palace circles, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace reportedly became deeply strained. Media insiders started noticing strange patterns almost immediately. Royal aides who once appeared closely aligned with Camilla allegedly became quieter. Certain ceremonial discussions reportedly shifted behind tighter administrative control. Even longtime palace commentators began openly speculating about legal distinctions between wife of the monarch and what one constitutional observer reportedly described as the true guardian of the crown. That phrase alone sent shockwaves through royal circles because it implied something devastating, that Camilla's role may never have carried the permanent institutional authority many assumed came automatically with the title of Queen Consort. The emotional consequences of those whispers reportedly hit with brutal force. According to sources familiar with palace tensions, Camilla became increasingly frustrated as conversations about constitutional limitations intensified behind closed doors. Some insiders claim she believed loyal support for Charles over decades had earned her unquestioned standing inside the monarchy, but others insist Queen Elizabeth had always viewed personal devotion and institutional legitimacy as two entirely separate matters. And as more reports surfaced suggesting dormant legal frameworks tied to consort authority were quietly being revisited, fear allegedly spread throughout sections of Camilla's inner circle that the monarchy was preparing to reassert boundaries that had remained invisible for years. According to palace administrative whispers, the response was not loud or theatrical. It was colder than that. Invitations reportedly changed. Meetings allegedly moved without notice. Advisors once loyal to Camilla suddenly distanced themselves. And behind closed doors, senior royals were said to be executing what insiders now call a silent constitutional counteroffensive. The shift reportedly began so quietly that many inside Buckingham Palace did not fully recognize what was happening until the atmosphere had already changed beyond repair. There were no dramatic public confrontations, no explosive declarations, and no visible institutional rebellion. Instead, the monarchy allegedly responded with something far more dangerous: silence, distance, and calculated isolation. Figures once regularly seen accompanying Camilla during sensitive palace discussions reportedly became harder to find. Long-standing advisors who had once appeared deeply embedded within her circle allegedly stopped attending key strategy meetings altogether. Various interpretations of internal palace behavior suggest the old guard had decided direct conflict would only deepen the crisis. Instead, they reportedly moved to slowly reclaim operational control through the invisible machinery of royal protocol itself. Princess Anne was said to be at the center of those efforts. Palace insiders increasingly describe her as the stabilizing force behind what many now whisper was a coordinated campaign to reinforce the monarchy's traditional hierarchy before irreversible damage could spread through the institution. And had reportedly spent years warning that personal loyalties inside the royal household could never be allowed to override constitutional discipline. Now, according to sources close to palace administrative streams, she believed the situation surrounding Camilla had evolved into something far larger than family tension. It had become a battle over the long-term credibility of the crown itself. And insiders claim Anne was no longer willing to treat it cautiously. Quietly, methodically, she allegedly began reasserting boundaries that had once existed naturally under Queen Elizabeth II but had weakened during Charles's emotional loyalty toward Camilla. At the same time, Prince William reportedly emerged as an increasingly powerful figure behind palace operations. Royal commentators noticed subtle but unmistakable changes in how institutional authority appeared to flow through Buckingham Palace. William, once careful not to interfere publicly in sensitive internal matters, was allegedly being positioned as a guardian of continuity during a period of growing uncertainty surrounding the king's health and the monarchy's future. Reports suggest senior palace staff were quietly instructed to reroute certain approvals and administrative channels through more traditional constitutional structures, limiting the informal influence Camilla's loyal faction allegedly enjoyed during the earlier stages of Charles's illness. Media commentators soon began noticing something else as well. Camilla herself appeared increasingly isolated during public engagements. There were whispers about altered seating arrangements, reduced involvement in sensitive discussions, and subtle shifts in the tone surrounding her public role beside the king. While official palace statements continued projecting unity, Insiders describe an atmosphere behind closed doors that had become emotionally brutal. Charles III was reportedly trapped between two forces tearing him apart from opposite directions. On one side stood his loyalty to the woman he had spent decades fighting to legitimize. On the other stood the crushing weight of the crown itself, an institution now allegedly warning that public trust could suffer catastrophic damage if internal instability continued escalating. Different interpretations of recent palace conversations suggest one phrase dominated discussions more than any other: the firm before the family. For long-time royal loyalists, it was not merely a slogan. It was a survival doctrine. For King Charles III, the nightmare was no longer political. It had become deeply personal. Reports suggest the monarch found himself trapped between the woman he spent decades fighting to protect and the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to inherit. Insiders claimed the strain inside palace walls became unbearable. For years, he had endured public criticism, institutional resistance, and personal humiliation in order to secure Camilla's acceptance beside him. Many believe that battle had finally ended the moment she stood beside him during the coronation, crowned Queen Consort under the gaze of the world. But now, insiders claim the king was being forced to confront the horrifying possibility that the very institution he inherited had never fully surrendered its private doubts about Camilla's long-term role within the monarchy. Reports suggest Charles became increasingly withdrawn as internal tensions escalated, struggling to balance personal devotion with the growing pressure surrounding constitutional stability. Senior royal advisors were reportedly becoming more direct in their warnings. Various interpretations of confidential palace discussions suggest Charles was repeatedly reminded that the monarchy's survival depended not on personal happiness but on public trust. Princess Anne allegedly emerged as one of the strongest voices pushing for institutional discipline during this period, warning that continued uncertainty surrounding Camilla's influence risked damaging the monarchy at a moment of already fragile confidence. To her, insiders whisper, the crown could not afford even the appearance of internal instability surrounding access, influence, or ceremonial authority. While Charles's health remained under intense public scrutiny, Prince William reportedly supported those concerns, though palace sources suggest his approach was quieter and more strategic. Different interpretations of internal conversations describe William emphasizing the importance of restoring stronger constitutional boundaries before public speculation spiraled beyond control. According to royal commentators, William increasingly viewed the crisis not simply as a dispute involving Camilla, but as a defining test for the monarchy's future under the next generation of leadership. The pressure surrounding Charles therefore intensified from every direction. Advisors allegedly pushed for institutional clarity and reportedly demanded stronger discipline. William quietly reinforced continuity planning. And at the center of it all stood a king emotionally torn between his private life and the ancient system he had spent his entire existence preparing to defend. There are even whispers that Charles attempted private mediation meetings in an effort to calm the growing divide inside palace walls. Sources familiar with royal administrative circles claimed the king desperately hoped tensions could be contained quietly before permanent damage was done. But insiders now suggest those efforts only revealed how deep the fractures had already become. Camilla allegedly viewed the escalating scrutiny as an unforgivable betrayal from the very establishment she believed she had finally earned acceptance from after years of loyalty to Charles. According to reports, she became increasingly furious over suggestions that hidden constitutional safeguards could override her standing beside the king despite everything she had endured publicly over decades. To Camilla's supporters, the entire situation reportedly felt like an orchestrated humiliation designed to quietly diminish her position after years of sacrifice. But to members of the old guard, insiders claimed the issue had evolved beyond emotion entirely. It was now about protecting the institution from long-term instability. The illusion of unity inside the royal family reportedly shattered the moment insiders realized the palace was no longer trying to silence the rumors completely. Instead, according to media figures and royal observers, controlled leaks began appearing almost everywhere, each one painting the same devastating picture. Camilla's position was no longer secure. For months, Buckingham Palace had operated with its usual disciplined silence, carefully shielding internal tensions behind polished public appearances and tightly controlled statements. But according to royal commentators, something suddenly changed. The denials became weaker. The language grew colder. And perhaps most revealing of all, certain palace insiders allegedly stopped trying to suppress speculation entirely. Reports concerning reduced consort influence began surfacing across respected royal reporting circles with unusual consistency. Different commentators speaking from different sources all seem to describe the same disturbing shift unfolding behind palace walls. Camilla, once viewed as firmly protected beside Charles after years of public rehabilitation, was now being quietly repositioned as a figure whose authority inside the monarchy had boundaries after all. And according to media observers, that message did not appear accidental. It appeared coordinated. Royal correspondents who had once defended the stability of Charles and Camilla's partnership suddenly began discussing the monarchy's future in strikingly different terms. Attention increasingly shifted toward Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose public image reportedly stood in sharp contrast to the turmoil surrounding the king's inner circle. Sources close to palace administrative operations claim growing sympathy inside royal circles began gravitating toward William and Catherine as symbols of continuity, discipline, and institutional calm during a period of growing uncertainty. Meanwhile, insiders claim Camilla's isolation inside palace operations became harder to conceal with each passing week. Discussions surrounding sensitive constitutional matters allegedly moved further away from her direct involvement. Palace sources describe an atmosphere of cold formality surrounding interactions with Camilla, as though long-standing relationships inside the royal household had suddenly become guarded and distant. Some insiders even whisper that staff members who once treated Camilla as an untouchable central figure now behaved with visible caution, aware that the balance of power inside Buckingham Palace was quietly shifting beneath everyone's feet. Charles III reportedly withdrew further from the conflict as the pressure surrounding the institution intensified. According to various interpretations of palace behavior, the king appeared increasingly exhausted by the impossible choice.